Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you might be, and welcome to it's sort of a book review, but it's an old book, so it's more of a book commentary, a book recommendation. It's about The Master and Margarita by Bulgakov. I've been reading this novel. It was published in 1966 during the golden era of communist Russia. And it gives a portrait of how fragile people's mental health can become within a system that has rigid notions about what sorts of thoughts are acceptable. I think this is relevant to how people are thinking today and the sort of groupthink enforcement mechanisms on the internet. When the system makes a gigantic mess, like a gigantic pile of garbage, people become afraid to acknowledge that mess, lest it tip over and crush everyone. Those who see it and say that they see it are treated as dangerous and are locked up or killed. And I think this is relevant to how some academic communities today function. They don't, of course, kill you, but they can definitely remove you from the discussion. The book, Master and Margarita, begins with a couple of poets who are approached by a foreigner who claims to be a professor. The poets had been discussing the necessity of making the figure of Jesus Christ appear absurd in their poems. One poet insists that Jesus must be portrayed as a figment of the historical imagination. The foreigner steps in to prove that Jesus Christ was a real person who existed, and he goes on to give a strikingly detailed account of the events leading up to his crucifixion. The account was so realistic and it made so much logical sense that some people might be persuaded based on the sense of realism. But the foreigner convinces his audience that he is insane by making the fantastical claim that he was present for the events in question, as in claiming that he is an immortal. In the foreigner's story, the Romans don't really want to execute Jesus because he's clearly a harmless, innocent kook. But the high priests insist on it because it is necessary to preserve obedience within their temple. If Jesus is not crucified, the people in the temple might revolt against the high priest, and the Roman army would be required to quell the uprising. Before the foreigner told this story, he had predicted the precise details of how one of the men in the room would die, and within minutes after the story ended, that very man walked out into the street and died in precisely the manner the foreigner had described. This sends one of the poets off in a mad search for this foreigner, a dangerous man who must be immediately arrested. Instead, the poet ends up in a madhouse after seeing a large black cat that walked around on its hind legs. The implication is that the foreigner is the devil himself. The foreigner makes another appearance in the apartment of a man who had died, of the man who had died, and he convinces the dead man's flatmate that he should fund a public performance created by him, the foreigner. And this flatmate then begins to develop symptoms of madness, seeing a large cat that walked around on its hind legs. This foreigner had convinced the landlord of the apartment complex to take a bribe from him in exchange for access to the dead man's rooms. And the landlord, he also develops symptoms of madness, becoming convinced that he had hallucinated the entire encounter. At this point in the story, I could conclude that either this foreigner is literally the devil, or I could conclude that fear of the system under which they live is making people crazy. The foreigner was introducing people to forbidden ideas, and the knowledge of these ideas was absolutely terrifying for them. At the time that I wrote this post, I was only halfway finished with the book, and I think I will write another one now that I've finished it. I don't want to give away any spoilers because it's a pretty good book. I like it. I like this book because my novel, the one I wrote, is also a critique of a system that makes people crazy. And in Bulgakov's novel, he's showing how communism makes people crazy. I guess I was trying to show how big science institutions make people crazy. And there's an element, there's a lot of similarity between how big science institutions operate and how communism operated. I think it's worth thinking about if you have found yourself swept up in the cult-like environment that is a big science laboratory. Thank you for watching. I hope you learned something and it gave you something to think about. Please check out